Britain is a geographical term. It's a big island off the coast of France, and it contains three political units: England, Scotland, and Wales. And then, of course, also there is the United Kingdom, which consists of Britain plus Northern Ireland. So we have four units in the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the underlying problem is that the natives of these four units don't like each other very much. In fact, they don't like each other at all. So we're a bit like the former Yugoslavia. In fact, we're very like the former Yugoslavia, which is perhaps not a good thing to be. But the English and the Scotch are rather like the Serbs and the Croats. They really don't like each other. The Welsh perhaps are a bit like, shall we say, Bosnians, off to one side of this bitter dispute. And the Northern Irish, of course, have their own political and religious issues, which we just don't need to get into. But the dominant partner in all this, of course, has been England. Though you will note that I was sent to boarding school in Scotland because Scots played such a dominant part in the British Empire. The Scots were very much overrepresented in the British Empire. And they continue to be overrepresented in politics. If you look at our recent prime ministers, and it's an ugly sight to look at our recent prime ministers, you have Blair, who pretended to be English, but I could tell he was Scottish. You have Brown, who is very clearly Scottish. You have Cameron, a Scottish clan name. You have Macmillan, a Scottish clan name. You have Sir Alec Douglas Hume, a very aristocratic Scottish name. There haven't been many English prime ministers. The Scots are very much overrepresented. And one result of this, going back a long time, is that English identity was rather suppressed. All the other nations of Europe were busily collecting Lithuanian fairy tales and Estonian ballads and Croat romances and whatnot. But in England, this didn't happen, not for a long time. So that the flourishing folk literature of England largely disappeared, as did their old, literary tradition, which goes back to Beowulf. All that just vanished, and it's still not readily recovered. It's a funny thing, when I was in America, they have an organization called T-Shirts of the World, and you've got a T-shirt with your flag on it, like the Turkish flag or whatever. So I said I wanted an English one. Hadn't got one. They sent me one with a Union Jack on it. I said, no, that's not England. That's the United Kingdom. I don't want that. I want the English flag. What's the English flag? Do you know? You do you? Well, yes, of course you do. That's where you see English identity. All the guys with red crosses on a white background. That's right. But it's illegal to fly it in England. It's thought to be nationalist. Well, it is, but you can fly a Scottish flag. The only place you can fly a St. George's Cross is from a church, because it's the Church of England. Okay, well, so Tolkien felt that English identity had been suppressed, and he was correct, and he wanted to bring it back. This is about establishing rule, and the Norman invasion was, in effect, an invasion of a dominant military aristocracy, and it was essential to them to suppress revolt. And they did that, of course, by, as we know from the 20th century, what do? You get rid of all the leaders, just like, well, you know, I don't like to mention things in modern times, but it is common for invasion to be followed by a massacre of all the intellectuals, the doctors, the teachers, and so on, to ensure that what's left is leaderless. And that's what the Normans did. Very, you know, they made a complete sweep. Not only did they dispossess, they took the land away from the landowners, the English landowners, they also got rid really of the English clerics. After 20 years or so, I think the only English senior churchman in England was the Bishop of Worcester. And he could not be removed because he was a saint. He was Saint Wulfstan. And even William the Conqueror felt it perhaps too much of a risk to execute a saint. But the rest were all just got rid of. And of course, that worked. That was a successful policy. Though Tolkien was always very interested, very, very interested in the signs of some sort of far off, hidden, backward, you know, revival, some kind of, some bit of old England still hiding away in a corner. And I think he thought it was in the far western English county of Herefordshire, which is close to where he came from. It is a very remote place, very, very small population, but there are signs that actually there the Norman conquest did not have very much effect. So it was really like the Shire. The Shire is another leftover, an enclave from an earlier age, unaffected by the world around it. So Tolkien is always interested in that, but that was because it didn't really happen. Well, in a way, my friend Harry Harrison and I, we've sort of written that one. We wrote 3 novels between us, which were called The Hammer and the Cross. The first one was called The Hammer and the Cross. And it wasn't quite what you said, but it was actually a vision of a different course taken in history, starting about the year 900. A bit earlier than the Norman conquest. We set it in the time of King Alfred, who was engaged in fighting the Vikings, the Norsemen, and we just wondered how it would have gone if he had taken a different course near the end of his life, and that was the start of it. And of course, then they diverged like that. But that was quite successful, I think. We combined fantasy and science fiction because we assumed that actually there would be scientific developments which the Normans had not got round to. And that was what we thought about quite a lot. Stories which say completely different things about them. And the simplest way of dealing with this is to say, this one is right, that one is wrong. Tolkien couldn't bear that. He wanted them all to be correct, but of course they'd been misunderstood. People had not understood them. There were people like Eomer in Lord of the Rings, who has heard stories about Galadriel, you know, the witch in the wood, and what he's heard is wrong. But actually, perhaps some of it is true, because he says, you know, that woman, Galadriel, she's very dangerous. And of course, the answer is, yes, she is dangerous, but not in the way you think. So Tolkien, I think, was very interested in misunderstood traditions. He thought that you know, people got things wrong all the time, but that was okay because he was going to tell us what was right. And he produced a version of elves which actually takes in a great deal of the things that people said about them, even though they are quite different. It's true that people fall in love with elves and then they pine away because everything else is so, so inferior. Well, that could well happen, but it's not their fault. They didn't mean that to happen. There are stories about, time being different in Elfland, and of course it is in Lothlorien. But that's not because time is different. It's because your understanding of time is different, and so on and so on and so on. So Tolkien brought all the traditions together and tried to make sense of them, including the confusion in Icelandic between Alvar, elves, and Svartalvar, black elves, who are clearly dwarves. How can you mix up an elf and a dwarf? Well, Tolkien told us a story about that in the Silmarillion, which is about Eolf, the dark elf. Okay, that settles that. People got it wrong, but he told the story right. I think Tolkien told us the answer to that too. You remember he told us that there's a big pot, and that's the pot of fairy tales, really. And all kinds of things fall into the pot, and then you stir them round, and then everybody takes a ladle out, and they get a different result. But if, for instance, Beowulf and Dede Korkut are similar, it's not because one has borrowed from the other. It's because they've all been in the pot. They, the stories and the legends, they swap around all the time. And I think that's just true. That the Odyssey, for instance, the Greek Odyssey, has the story of the one-eyed giant. It has the story of the witch who turns men into pigs. I forget what the others are. There are the story of the cannibals, the story of the sirens. It's all in there. That wasn't invented by Homer, the author of the Odyssey. They all came out of the pot. And that is true, I'm sure, of Beowulf and Dede Korkut too. They've all taken things out of this giant background of fairy tales. And I have a very big collection of fairy tales, actually, which I have from everywhere. The Punjab, Mallorca, Lithuania, whatever. I collect them all. I don't think Tolkien ever quite solved this. I think that's the missing part of Tolkien studies. He had this belief in the lost road, um, and I can see how he came to that belief. In fact, I've written a piece in Christopher's memorial volume, which tries to explain how it all came about. Um, but although he had, I think, an idea of a kind of a myth and a belief, he never actually managed to match it to stories. He had, as it were, this idea of the lost straight road and the other world, the far in the Western Sea, which isn't there anymore. Um, but and he meant to tell recurrent stories about it, but he couldn't think of good stories. That was the problem. In a way, the image or the dream was too powerful for the creation of character. And of course, he tended to think that it was the same character every time. The names are always the same: Albuin, Edwin, Alwyn, and the Numenorian names, which I'm afraid I've forgotten, but they all mean the same thing. But actually, if you want to tell a collection of stories, you need different characters. And Tolkien never quite solved that. I can see what his idea was, but I don't think he got very far with it. In fact, he got stuck on the philology. Uh, but the philology should be the background to the story. It should not be the story. And so that is rather a mystery as to what he intended. Obviously, his devotion to his father uh, controlled his life. That was the main thing that he did. But I always remember that he was also, like his father, a comparative philologist of considerable merit, and so in many ways he just shared his father's ideas and attitudes, and so he was a very good editor. He knew how to bring out the best of his father's, very confused works written at different times in different ways and different handwritings. Well, Christopher did us a great service by organizing all that, and we would know far less without it. Going on to the two books you mentioned, well, from what I've said, I think it's quite clear. Tolkien couldn't have been a code master and a spy master. He didn't have time. He was too busy. Actually, Tolkien's life is very, very, very well recorded. You can look it up in Hammond and Scull's chronology. You can see what he was doing every day. He was at a committee meeting. He was interviewing graduate students. He was giving lectures. He had a very public life, which was very carefully recorded. He couldn't fit all that other stuff in. Someone would have noticed. So I think that's just fantasy, really. As for the book by his brother, well, that would be very interesting. But of course, we haven't seen it. But it would be, I think, it would be a different light on Tolkien, and perhaps show him in a less public way. His public life is very well recorded, but we know very little of his private life. He didn't want anyone to know about his private life. But what his brother said, that would be quite interesting, I think. And I'm sorry that the Tolkien estate won't allow it to be published. I can't see why not. But then, of course, they say it is quoting from letters and things, and perhaps they have some idea that one day they will bring out these letters and have another book. But I, that is, I think, well, I think it would be interesting to read what Hilary had to say, and the idea that we might get a second volume of letters. Well, all right, who's going to do it? So yes, it's a pity that that was not allowed. I think it was the wish for privacy. I said Tolkien Senior was a very private person, and Christopher was a very private person, and it was impossible to be a private person, because if someone knew where you lived, people knocking on the door all the time. And that's really true. People would knock on the door. They'd visit from America and say, I really like your books, Professor. And you think, I was hoping to have some time off. So he had, I think, to go away and not only live in a different country, but also sort of shut himself off, so that he could not be reached. Well, it's a pity, but I think when I talked to Tolkien, which was just before he died, I realized that far too many people had already interviewed Tolkien and asked him things, asked him more. And so I just didn't do that. I didn't ask him any questions. I told him things instead. And I think he just relaxed when he realized I wasn't going to interrogate him. So I told him about Birmingham, and I told him about the school, and I told him about our rugby team. And he was very interested in the rugby team. No one else was, but he was. And I think it took him back, 50 years, 60 years. He was very interested in the names of the players. He made me go through the kind of team sheet. And I think he was thinking, I wonder if that's the grandson of old so-and-so. And it probably was. It probably was. We had somebody playing for us who was called Peter Neave. And of course, Tolkien's Aunt Jane was Jane Neave. So he wanted to find out, was Peter related to Jane? And he probably was, but I never asked him. He was probably a remote cousin or something like that. So I think Tolkien really welcomed a bit of peace, and a chance to talk about something other than himself, because they wanted to ask about him all the time and demand answers to questions. You can see that must get very tiring. So I think probably Christopher felt the same way as his father, and of course it got steadily worse as time went by. I remember one thing, and this is the last thing I'll say. I spoke to Tolkien's secretary, Joy Hill, and she said, you know, there are things we don't dare to tell him. We open all the letters that come, and some we don't pass on. And I said, like what? And she said, well, we got a letter from someone in California who was a hippie, you know, and a drug user. And he said he really liked The Lord of the Rings. He liked it so much that he climbed a mountain, and on the top of the mountain, he built a fire, and in the fire, he burned his wedding ring. Tolkien would have been very upset by someone burning his wedding ring. So they didn't tell him. Well, thank you. Thanks to the Society for your interest. Talk again sometime. Bye.